The flames consumed everything she had spent years cultivating. And Rebecca Turner watched through tear-blurred eyes as the townspeople of Bozeman, Montana, cheered while her carefully dried herbs turned to ash in the spring of 1877. She stood in the town square with her wrists bound behind her back, the rough rope cutting into her skin as Reverend Michaels proclaimed her a danger to good Christian souls, his finger pointing at her like a weapon while the crowd grew more fervent in their condemnation. The midwife trade had been her livelihood for 3 years since she had arrived in this mountain town at age 20, helping women through childbirth with knowledge passed down from her grandmother. But one stillborn baby and whispered accusations had turned her neighbors into a mob, faster than she could have imagined possible. The mountain man, watching from the edge of the crowd, had shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, and Dalton Davies felt his jaw tighten as he observed the injustice unfolding before him. He had come down from his trap lines in the high country to trade pelts and restock supplies, not expecting to witness what looked like something from the Salem witch trials playing out in 1877 Montana. His long dark hair hung past his collar, and his muscled arms crossed over his chest as he assessed the situation with the careful attention of a man who had survived alone in the wilderness for the better part of a decade. Something about the way the woman held herself, despite her obvious fear, the dignity in her bearing even as everything she owned burned, made him think of his own mother who had died when a frontier doctor refused to listen to her about her own body. Rebecca felt the heat from the flames on her face, and she wondered if they would burn her next, despite this supposedly being a civilized time and place. Sheriff Coleman stood off to the side, looking uncomfortable but doing nothing to stop the destruction. And she understood then that the law would not protect her here. Martha Hendricks, the woman whose baby had been born blue and silent just 2 weeks earlier, stood at the front of the crowd with tears streaming down her face. And Rebecca felt more sorrow for her than anger, because she understood the desperate need to blame someone when grief became too heavy to carry alone. "That is enough," Dalton said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. He moved forward with the confident stride of a man who had faced down grizzly bears and mountain lions, his 6'4" frame parting the crowd as people instinctively stepped aside. His buckskin jacket stretched across his broad chest, and his blue eyes fixed on Reverend Michaels with an intensity that made the religious man take a step backward. "You have burned her property. Release her." Reverend Michaels puffed up his chest, trying to reclaim authority. "This is town business, stranger. The woman has been practicing dark arts, causing the death of innocent babies. We have every right to protect our community." "She is a midwife," Dalton said, his tone flat and dangerous. "My mother was a midwife. Sometimes babies die, and it is a tragedy. But it is not witchcraft. It is the harsh reality of this world." He moved closer to Rebecca, and she looked up at him with green eyes that reflected both hope and caution. "Sheriff, are there formal charges against this woman?" Sheriff Coleman shifted his weight, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Well, no formal charges exactly. But the town council decided, then she's free to go." Dalton pulled a knife from his belt, and then several men in the crowd reached for their own weapons. But he simply moved behind Rebecca and cut through the ropes binding her wrists. She gasped as the pressure released, bringing her hands forward to rub at the raw marks left behind. "Get your horse if you have one. We are leaving." "I do not have a horse," Rebecca said quietly, her voice hoarse from smoke and unshed tears. "They took everything." Dalton looked at the crowd with disgust before turning back to Sheriff Coleman. "I am taking her. Anyone who has a problem with that can address it with me." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and the way his hand rested near the pistol at his hip made it clear he was prepared to back up those words with action. "Now wait just a minute," Reverend Michael started. But Dalton fixed him with a stare that silenced whatever else he had been about to say. "You have already committed assault and destruction of property," Dalton said. "Do you want to add attempted murder to your sins, Reverend? Because that is where this was heading." He placed a hand on Rebecca's shoulder, and she flinched slightly before steadying herself. "Come. My horse can carry us both until we get you somewhere safe." Rebecca looked back at the smoldering remains of her herbs, the medicinal plants she had spent 3 years collecting and preparing, all reduced to ashes. Her small cabin at the edge of town had been ransacked earlier, her few possessions scattered or destroyed, and she had nothing left here except painful memories. She nodded and let Dalton guide her through the crowd, which parted reluctantly before them. His horse was a massive dappled gray stallion that looked capable of carrying 2 people without strain. And Dalton swung into the saddle before reaching down to pull Rebecca up behind him. She hesitated only a moment before accepting his hand, surprised by the gentleness in his grip, despite the obvious strength in his calloused fingers. She settled behind him, unsure where to put her hands, until he took them and wrapped them around his waist. "Hold tight," he said. And then they were moving, leaving Bozeman behind as they headed into the mountains. They rode in silence for over an hour, climbing higher into the pine-covered slopes while the spring air grew cooler around them. Rebecca gradually relaxed her rigid posture, exhausted from the terror and adrenaline of the morning, and she found herself leaning against the solid warmth of Dalton's back. She could feel the play of muscles beneath his shirt as he guided the horse up the narrow trail, and she wondered what kind of man willingly inserted himself into a mob's fury to save a stranger. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Dalton slowed the horse to a walk and spoke over his shoulder. "There is a settlement about 2 hours north of here. The Crow people have a camp, and there is a woman there who might be willing to take you in. Her name is Laughing Waters, and she knows healing arts. The Crow respect such knowledge." Rebecca lifted her head from where it had been resting against his shoulder blade. "You know the Crow?" "I have traded with them for years. They are good people, honest in their dealings." He paused, then added, "They will not burn your herbs or call you a witch for knowing how to help with childbirth." Tears suddenly burned in Rebecca's eyes, the first time she had allowed herself to truly feel the weight of what had happened. That baby was already dead when I arrived. The cord was wrapped around his neck, and he had been like that for too long. I tried everything I knew, but there was nothing anyone could have done. "I know," Dalton said quietly. "I could see it in your face back there. You carry the guilt of it, even though it was not your fault." "Martha trusted me," Rebecca whispered. "She called for me when her pain started, and I failed her." Dalton pulled the horse to a stop and turned in the saddle to look at her. His face was weathered from years in the sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of hard living. But his expression held unexpected compassion. "You did not fail her? Nature failed her? God failed her if there is a God. But you tried to help, and that matters. Do not let those people make you believe otherwise." Rebecca met his gaze, seeing sincerity there, and something in her chest loosened slightly. "Why did you help me? You do not know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you were being treated unjustly, and I know I could not stand by and watch it happen." He turned back to face forward and urged the horse into motion again. "My name is Dalton Davies. I trap and hunt in these mountains, have been doing so for about 10 years now, since I was 23. "Rebecca Turner," she replied. "I am 23 now. I came to Bozeman 3 years ago after my grandmother died. She taught me the healing arts, and I thought I could make a life helping other women." She laughed bitterly. "I suppose I was wrong about that." "You were not wrong," Dalton said. "You just landed in the wrong town. Fear makes people cruel, and that reverend used their fear for his own purposes." They continued climbing, and Rebecca watched as the landscape transformed around them. Dense pine forests gave way to alpine meadows beginning to bloom with early spring flowers. And in the distance, snow-capped peaks pierced the clear blue sky. She had been so focused on her work in Bozeman that she had rarely ventured into the true wilderness surrounding the town, and she found herself awed by the raw beauty spreading out before them. As darkness began to fall, Dalton guided them to a small clearing beside a rushing creek. "We will camp here tonight," he said, dismounting before helping Rebecca down. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly as her feet hit the ground. His hand steadied her at her waist, and she became acutely aware of how small she felt next to his imposing frame. "Can you gather some wood for a fire while I tend to the horse?" Rebecca nodded, grateful to have something useful to do. She moved through the darkening forest, collecting fallen branches and dry twigs, while Dalton unsaddled the gray and rubbed the animal down with practiced efficiency. By the time she returned with an armload of wood, he had already cleared a space for a fire and arranged stones in a circle. He built the fire with quick, economical movements, and soon flames were crackling cheerfully in the growing darkness. From his saddlebags, Dalton produced dried venison, hardtack, and a small pouch of coffee. "It is not fancy," he said, "but it will keep us fed." "It is more than I expected to have today," Rebecca said honestly. She had thought she might be locked up or worse, and instead she was sitting beside a warm fire in the mountains with a stranger who had risked himself to save her. "Thank you, Dalton, for everything." He glanced at her across the flames, his features cast in shadow and light. "You do not need to keep thanking me." "I do, though," she insisted. "What you did was incredibly brave. That crowd could have turned on you." "They were cowards picking on a woman alone," Dalton said with a shrug of those massive shoulders. "Cowards usually back down when confronted." They ate in companionable silence, and Rebecca found herself studying her rescuer when she thought he was not looking. He moved with the grace of someone completely comfortable in the wilderness, and there was a quietness to him that spoke of long periods spent in solitude. His hands were scarred from hard work, and she noticed he wore no wedding ring. Not that many men in the frontier did, even if they were married. "You said you have been in the mountains for 10 years, she ventured. "Do you ever get lonely?" Dalton considered the question while he chewed a piece of jerky. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I prefer the company of trees and animals to most people I have met. Present company excepted," he added with a slight smile that transformed his serious face. Rebecca found herself smiling back. "I understand that sentiment more now than I did this morning." "What will you do?" Dalton asked. "After we reach the Crow camp, I mean. Will you stay there, or do you have family elsewhere?" "I have no family left," Rebecca said. "My parents died of cholera when I was 14, and my grandmother raised me until she passed 3 years ago. I suppose I will stay wherever they will have me and try to rebuild." She stared into the fire, watching sparks spiral up into the night sky. "It is strange how quickly your entire life can change. This morning I had a home and a purpose. Tonight I have nothing but the clothes on my back." "You have your knowledge," Dalton said. "They could burn your herbs, but they could not burn what you know. That is still yours." His words settled over her like a blanket, warming something deep inside that had felt frozen since she watched her supplies go up in flames. "You are wise for a mountain man. Spending time alone gives you plenty of opportunity to think," he replied. He poured coffee from the pot he had set in the coals, offering her a battered tin cup filled with a strong, bitter brew. "Get some rest. We have another hard ride tomorrow." Dalton gave her his bedroll despite her protests, and he settled himself with his back against a tree, rifle across his lap, keeping watch through the night. Rebecca lay wrapped in the blanket that smelled of pine smoke and leather, listening to the creek rushing nearby and the occasional crack of the fire. She should have been terrified, alone in the wilderness with a man she had just met. But instead, she felt safer than she had in months. There was something solid and trustworthy about Dalton Davies, something that made her believe he would protect her as he had promised. She woke before dawn to find him rebuilding the fire, moving quietly to avoid disturbing her. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with streaks of pink and gold, and a light frost covered the meadow grass. Rebecca sat up, pushing hair out of her face, and Dalton glanced over at her. "There is coffee," he said, gesturing to the pot. "We should eat and get moving soon. We have a lot of ground to cover." They shared a simple breakfast of hardtack softened in coffee, and then Dalton saddled the gray, while Rebecca rolled up the bedding. Within a half hour, they were back on the trail, climbing higher into the mountains. The morning air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and the green smell of growing things, and Rebecca found herself appreciating the wild beauty around them despite her uncertain circumstances. "Tell me about your mother," she said, after they had been riding for a while, her arms wrapped around Dalton's waist as the horse picked its way along a narrow ledge. "You said she was a midwife." Dalton was silent for so long that Rebecca thought he would not answer. But finally he spoke. "She helped women in our settlement back in Ohio. I was just a boy. But I remember how people would come to our door at all hours, and she would go with them no matter the weather or time. She saved a lot of lives." He paused, and his voice grew harder. "When I was 12, she got sick. Some kind of fever. The doctor in town refused to treat her because we could not pay his fee up front. She died 3 days later." "I am so sorry," Rebecca said softly. "My father took off after that, could not handle the grief. I ended up working various jobs until I was old enough to head west. I figured if I was going to be alone anyway, might as well be somewhere beautiful." He gestured at the vast wilderness around them. "Found my way to Montana and never left." "It is beautiful," Rebecca agreed. "Harsh, but beautiful. Like most worthwhile things," Dalton said. They rode through terrain that grew increasingly rugged, crossing streams swollen with snowmelt and navigating through dense stands of lodgepole pine. Dalton proved to be an excellent guide, always seeming to know the best path, pointing out animal tracks and naming the birds that called from the trees. Rebecca found herself fascinated by his knowledge of the wilderness, the way he read the landscape like she might read a medical text. Late in the afternoon, Dalton guided them down into a broad valley, where a river sparkled in the sunlight. On the far side, Rebecca could see several dozen lodges arranged in a loose circle, smoke rising from cooking fires. Dogs barked as they approached, and children stopped their play to watch the strangers ride into camp. A woman emerged from one of the larger lodges, her long black hair braided with strips of red cloth, her dress decorated with intricate quill work. She smiled broadly when she saw Dalton, calling out a greeting in a language Rebecca did not understand. Dalton responded in the same language before switching to English. "Laughing Waters, it is good to see you. I have brought someone who needs help." Laughing Waters approached as Dalton dismounted, her dark eyes assessing Rebecca with keen intelligence. "You bring a woman this time instead of just pelts? The mighty lone wolf finally finds a mate?" "It is not like that," Dalton said. But Rebecca noticed a slight redness creeping up his neck. "She is a healer, a midwife. Her town turned against her, burned her supplies. I thought perhaps you could use another woman who knows the medicine ways. Laughing, Waters reached up to help Rebecca down from the horse, and Rebecca was surprised by the strength in her grip. The Crow woman looked to be in her 40s, her face lined but beautiful, and her smile was warm as she studied Rebecca's face. A healer is always welcome here. What is your name, daughter? Rebecca Turner, she replied. I am grateful for your kindness in considering me. Any friend of Dalton's is welcome in our camp, Laughing Waters said. Though I confess I am surprised he has friends at all, as little as we see him. She shot Dalton a teasing look. Come, you must both be tired and hungry. We will feed you, and Rebecca can tell me of her skills. Dalton spent the next hour in the camp, sharing news and trade goods with the Crow people who greeted him like an old friend. Rebecca stayed close to Laughing Waters, who brought her to her lodge and offered her water to wash and a blanket to wrap around her shoulders. Inside the dwelling, dried herbs and plants hung from the ceiling, and Rebecca felt a pang of recognition seeing the careful way they had been preserved. You know plants, Laughing Waters observed, noticing Rebecca's interest. Can you name these? Rebecca moved closer, studying the dried bundles. That is yarrow, good for stopping bleeding, and that is raspberry leaf, helpful during pregnancy. This one, she touched a particularly full bundle, is motherwort. My grandmother used it for anxiety and to help after childbirth. Laughing Waters nodded approvingly. You do know the medicine ways. Your grandmother taught you well. Why did your people turn against you? Rebecca explained what had happened with Martha's baby, the accusations, and the burning of her supplies. Laughing, Waters listened intently, her expression growing sad. Fear is a poison, she said when Rebecca finished. It makes people forget their humanity. We have lost babies too, many babies. It is the way of this hard world. But we do not blame the women who try to help. We honor them. She placed a hand on Rebecca's shoulder. You are safe here. If you wish to stay, you can learn our ways, and we can learn from you. It would be a good exchange. Relief flooded through Rebecca so powerfully that tears spilled down her cheeks. Thank you, she managed. I would like that very much. Dalton appeared at the entrance to the lodge, ducking his head to fit through the opening. I need to head back to my trap lines, he said, looking at Rebecca. But Laughing Waters will take good care of you. You will be safe here. Rebecca stood quickly, suddenly panicked at the thought of him leaving. He had been her anchor through the nightmare of the past day, and the idea of him disappearing back into the mountains made her feel unmoored. Will you come back to visit? Something flickered in Dalton's blue eyes, an emotion Rebecca could not quite name. I come through here every few months to trade. I will check on you, make sure you are settling in well. I will look forward to it, Rebecca said, and she meant it more than she wanted to examine too closely. Dalton nodded to Laughing Waters, then turned and left the lodge. Rebecca moved to the entrance to watch him swing onto his gray horse, and he looked back at her one last time before riding out of camp. She watched until he disappeared among the trees, feeling an unexpected sense of loss. That one, Laughing Waters said from behind her, has been alone too long. It is good for him to have someone to come back to. Rebecca turned to look at the older woman. We only just met. He was being kind, that is all. Laughing Waters' eyes crinkled with amusement. If you say so, daughter. Come, let me show you where you will sleep and introduce you to the other women. You have much to learn about our people. The following weeks passed in a blur of new experiences. Rebecca threw herself into learning everything Laughing Waters could teach her from the Crow language to the medicinal properties of plants that did not grow in the regions where her grandmother had lived. The Crow people welcomed her cautiously at first, but as she proved her knowledge and willingness to help, they gradually accepted her into their community. She assisted Laughing Waters with 2 births during her first month in the camp, both successful, and felt some of the guilt and pain from Martha's loss begin to ease. The Crow women taught her to tan hides and prepare pemmican, skills she had never learned in town, and she found satisfaction in the work of daily survival that kept her hands and mind busy. But in the quiet moments, usually at night when she lay in her furs listening to the sounds of the camp settling to sleep, Rebecca found her thoughts drifting to Dalton. She wondered where he was in the vast wilderness, whether he was safe, if he thought of her at all. It seemed foolish to develop feelings for a man she had known for less than 2 days, but she could not deny the way her heart had lifted when he had stepped between her and that mob, or the sense of safety she had felt with her arms around his waist as they rode through the mountains. Spring turned to early summer, and Dalton did not appear. Rebecca told herself she was being ridiculous, that he probably had not meant anything special by his promise to check on her. But disappointment still gnawed at her each time someone called out that a rider was approaching, and it turned out to be someone else. Then one morning in late June, when the valley was rich with summer growth and the river ran clear and low, a familiar gray horse trotted into camp, carrying a rider whose long hair and broad shoulders made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat. She was working outside Laughing Waters Lodge, grinding herbs with a stone mortar, and she looked up to find Dalton dismounting near the center of camp. He looked leaner than she remembered, his face more weathered, but when his eyes found her across the distance, his entire expression softened into something that made her heart race. "Rebecca," he said, walking toward her with that confident stride she remembered so well. "You look well." "As do you," she replied, standing and wiping her hands on her dress. She wanted to throw her arms around him, but held back, conscious of the entire camp watching their reunion with interest. "How have you been? Your trapping went well?" "Well enough," Dalton said. "I have been thinking about you, wondering if you were settling in here." "I am," Rebecca said, smiling. "The people have been wonderful, and Laughing Waters is an excellent teacher. I have learned so much." Laughing Waters emerged from the lodge, her eyes twinkling with barely suppressed amusement. "Dalton, what a surprise to see you back so soon. Usually many more moons pass between visits." Dalton had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I was in the area." "Of course you were," Laughing Waters said, her tone making it clear she did not believe that for a moment. "You must stay for the evening meal. We are having a feast tonight to celebrate the summer solstice." "I would not want to intrude," Dalton started, but Rebecca cut him off. "Please stay," she said. "I would like to hear about your travels." Something in her tone must have conveyed more than just polite interest, because Dalton's expression shifted, becoming more intent. "Then I will stay." The feast that evening was a joyous affair with roasted venison, fresh fish from the river, and various dishes made from roots and berries. Dalton sat beside Rebecca on one of the logs arranged around the central fire, and she was intensely aware of every time his arm brushed against hers. They talked easily, sharing stories from the past months, and Rebecca found herself laughing more than she had in years. "You seem happy here," Dalton observed as the celebration continued around them, drums beating out a steady rhythm while some of the younger people danced. "I am," Rebecca said truthfully. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I belong somewhere. The work is meaningful, and no one fears me for knowing how to help with healing." "I am glad," Dalton said. "I have been worried about you." Have you? Rebecca asked, turning to look at him directly. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the intensity in his eyes. Yes, he admitted. More than I probably should have been, given we barely know each other. Sometimes knowing someone is not about time, Rebecca said softly. Sometimes you just recognize something in another person, a kindred spirit, perhaps. Dalton held her gaze, and the noise of the celebration seemed to fade away until there was only the two of them and the understanding passing between them. Rebecca, I need to tell you something. What is it? I cannot stop thinking about you, he said bluntly. I tried to focus on my work, on the trap lines and hunting, but my mind kept drifting back to you, to the way you held your head high even when everything was falling apart, to your courage and kindness, to the feeling of you holding on to me as we rode. He paused, running a hand through his long hair. I know I have no right to these feelings. You are building a new life here, and I have nothing to offer but a rough existence in the mountains. But I had to tell you. Rebecca's heart was pounding so hard, she was sure he must be able to hear it. Dalton, I have been thinking about you too, hoping you would come back, wondering if what I felt during those days we spent together was real, or just my mind trying to cope with trauma. And now, he asked, now that I am here? Now I know it was real, she said. She reached out and took his hand, feeling the rough calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers as they closed around hers. I do not know what this means or where it can go, but I know I want to find out. Dalton lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I want that too, more than I have wanted anything in a very long time. They sat together as the celebration continued, hands intertwined, talking quietly about hopes and dreams and the possibility of a future neither had expected to find. When the festivities finally began to wind down and people drifted to their lodges, Dalton walked Rebecca to the place where she slept. I will be staying for a few days, he said. There are some repairs needed on weapons and tools that the people have asked me to help with. Will you spend time with me? Every moment I can spare, Rebecca promised. Over the next 3 days, Rebecca and Dalton were nearly inseparable. She introduced him to the finer points of herb preparation when he showed interest, and he taught her to improve her shooting with the rifle Laughing Waters had given her for hunting. They walked along the river in the long summer evenings, sharing stories from their pasts, learning the details of each other's lives. Rebecca discovered that Dalton loved poetry, surprising for a rough mountain man, and that he had a dry sense of humor that made her laugh unexpectedly. Dalton learned that Rebecca had once dreamed of being a teacher before her grandmother needed help, and taught her healing instead, and that she sang beautifully when she thought no one was listening. On the 3rd evening, they sat on a bluff overlooking the valley, watching the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Dalton had his arm around Rebecca's shoulders, and she was leaned against his solid warmth, feeling more content than she could remember feeling. I have to head back to my trap lines tomorrow, Dalton said reluctantly. But Rebecca, I want to court you properly. I want to see where this connection between us leads. Rebecca turned to face him, seeing the vulnerability in his expression beneath the rugged exterior. I want that too. But how will we manage it? You live in the wilderness, and I am building a life here, helping these people. I have been thinking about that, Dalton said. What if I built a cabin closer to this valley? I could still trap and hunt, but I would be near enough to see you regularly. And when winter comes, you could stay with me if you wanted, or I could stay here in the camp if they would allow it. You would do that? Rebecca asked, touched by his willingness to change his solitary lifestyle. Give up your isolation for me? Rebecca, isolation has been my habit, not my preference, Dalton said. I retreated into the mountains because I did not fit in settlements, and I had no reason to try. But you make me want to try. You make me want to build something more than just a basic shelter for surviving winters. Rebecca cupped his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of several days' beard growth beneath her palms. I would like that very much. I want to build something with you, Dalton. Something real and lasting. He leaned down and kissed her then, gentle at first, but deepening as she responded, her arms wrapping around his neck. It was a kiss full of promise and longing, of two people who had found each other against all odds and were determined not to let go. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. I will come back in a month, he promised, and I will start looking for a good place to build our home. Our home, Rebecca repeated, loving the sound of those words. Be safe out there, Dalton Davies. Always, he said. I have something worth coming back to now. He left at dawn the next morning, but not before kissing Rebecca thoroughly enough to make several of the camp women giggle and Laughing Waters give Rebecca a knowing smile. Rebecca watched him ride away again, but this time she did not feel the same sense of loss. This time she knew with certainty that he would return. True to his word, Dalton appeared again in late July, this time with news that he had found the perfect spot for a cabin about 2 hours' ride from the Crow camp. It was a sheltered valley with a good spring, plenty of timber for building, and enough meadow land to support a small herd of animals if they wanted to keep livestock. Come see it, he urged Rebecca. I want to make sure you approve before I start building. Rebecca got permission from Laughing Waters to be away for a few days, and she rode out with Dalton the next morning. The site he had chosen was indeed perfect, nestled between two ridges with a clear stream running through it and a spectacular view of the surrounding mountains. Rebecca could immediately envision a cabin here, with a garden plot for herbs and vegetables, and perhaps a small barn for animals. It is beautiful, she said, turning in a circle to take it all in. We could be happy here, Dalton. We will be happy here, he corrected, pulling her into his arms. I am going to build you a home worthy of you, Rebecca Turner. A place where you can practice your healing without fear, where we can build a life together. They spent 2 days at the site, with Dalton showing Rebecca exactly where he planned to position the cabin and outbuildings. He had clearly put serious thought into every aspect, from the orientation to catch the winter sun to the proximity to fresh water. Rebecca found herself falling even deeper in love with this man, who was willing to put down roots for her after years of wandering. On their last night before returning to the Crow camp, they lay side by side on blankets under a canopy of stars, talking about the future. I want to marry you, Dalton said suddenly. I know it has only been a few months since we met, but I have never been more certain of anything. I want you to be my wife, Rebecca. Rebecca rolled onto her side to look at him, seeing the sincerity in his expression. Are you asking me or telling me? She teased gently. Dalton turned to face her, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. I am asking. Rebecca Turner, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a mountain man who has more skills with traps and rifles than with pretty words, but who loves you more than he thought he could love anyone? Yes, Rebecca said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you, Dalton Davies. I love you too, and I want to spend my life with you. He kissed her then, with a passion that made her head spin and her body warm in ways she had never experienced. They held each other under the stars, making whispered promises and plans, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. They returned to the Crow camp the next day and shared their news with Laughing Waters, who laughed with delight and immediately began planning a proper celebration. "You must have a crow wedding," she insisted. "It would honor us to join you in our way." Dalton and Rebecca agreed happily, and over the next week, preparations were made. Laughing Waters and the other women created a beautiful dress for Rebecca, decorated with quill work and beadwork in intricate patterns. Dalton was given new buckskins that had been carefully crafted and decorated with symbols of strength and protection. The wedding ceremony took place on a warm August evening with the entire camp in attendance. It was a blend of Crow traditions and more familiar Christian vows, with an elderly shaman overseeing the proceedings. Rebecca and Dalton exchanged promises to honor and care for each other, to face whatever hardships came together, and to build a life rooted in love and respect. When the shaman declared them married, Dalton swept Rebecca into his arms and kissed her to the cheers and laughter of the assembled people. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with food and dancing and songs in both English and the Crow language. Finally, as the moon rose high overhead, Dalton led Rebecca away from the celebration to a lodge that had been prepared for them. Inside, away from the noise and revelry, they came together as husband and wife, learning each other's bodies with gentle exploration and growing passion. Rebecca had never known such intimacy was possible, and she fell asleep in Dalton's arms, feeling complete in a way she never had before. They spent 2 more weeks in the Crow camp, with Dalton helping with various tasks and Rebecca continuing her work with Laughing Waters. Then, as September approached, they packed up their belongings and headed to the valley where Dalton had chosen to build their home. The next months passed in a blur of hard work. Dalton proved to be an expert builder, and with Rebecca's help, a sturdy cabin took shape in their valley. They worked side by side, cutting and hauling timber, notching logs, raising walls. Rebecca's hands, once soft from town living, grew calloused from the labor, but she did not mind. Every log they placed was another piece of the home they were creating together. By late October, the cabin was finished and furnished with simple but well-made furniture that Dalton crafted during the evenings. Rebecca had established a good herb garden before the first frost, transplanting specimens she had collected from the surrounding mountains with Laughing Waters' help. They had a good supply of preserved food for winter, and Dalton's hunting kept them well stocked with fresh meat. Their first winter together was magical despite the harsh weather. Snow piled high around the cabin, and temperatures dropped low enough to freeze water solid. But inside their home, Rebecca and Dalton created a warm haven. They spent long evenings by the fire, with Dalton reading aloud from the few books he owned while Rebecca worked on sewing projects or prepared medicines. They made love frequently, learning each other's rhythms and preferences, finding joy in the physical expression of their emotional bond. Rebecca had never imagined marriage could be like this, full of laughter and passion and genuine partnership. Dalton treated her as an equal, asking her opinions on everything from where to expand the cabin in the spring to which trap lines to check first when the weather cleared. In March, as the snow began to melt and the first green shoots pushed through the wet earth, Rebecca realized her monthly courses had not come in nearly 3 months. She waited another week to be certain before telling Dalton, wanting to be sure of her condition. She chose an evening when he had just returned from checking traps, meeting him at the door with a smile that must have communicated something because he immediately set down his pack and gave her his full attention. "What is it?" he asked, his hands coming up to frame her face. "You look like you are about to burst with news." "I am with child," Rebecca said simply. We are going to have a baby. Dalton's eyes widened, and for a moment, he just stared at her. Then a grin spread across his face, transforming his usually serious expression into something radiant. A baby? We are going to be parents? Yes. Rebecca laughed as he swept her up and spun her around carefully. Probably sometime in late summer or early autumn. I am going to be a father, Dalton said wonderingly, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. Rebecca, you have made me happier than I ever thought possible. And you have given me a home and a life beyond anything I imagined, Rebecca replied, standing on her toes to kiss him. We are going to be good parents, Dalton. With you as their mother, our children will be blessed, he said, placing a hand gently over her still flat stomach. I promise to protect both of you with everything I have. As spring progressed into summer, Rebecca's belly grew round with their child. Dalton became even more protective, insisting she rest more and not overexert herself. He took over the heavier chores around the cabin and homestead, and he brought her wildflowers from his trap lines just to see her smile. Rebecca continued her healing work, with people from the Crow camp and occasionally other settlers making the journey to their valley when they needed medical help. Word had spread about the skilled midwife living in the mountains with the protective mountain man, and Rebecca found satisfaction in using her knowledge to help others without fear of persecution. Laughing Waters visited regularly, checking on Rebecca's pregnancy and bringing gifts for the coming baby. You are carrying well, she observed during a visit in July. Strong and healthy. Your baby will be born when the leaves begin to turn. Will you help me when the time comes? Rebecca asked. I know the theory of childbirth from helping others, but to be the one giving birth is different. Of course I will help you, daughter, Laughing Waters said, squeezing Rebecca's hand. And your mountain man will pace outside like a caged bear, and everything will be fine. Rebecca laughed, able to picture exactly that scenario. Dalton had already expressed his anxiety about the coming birth multiple times, worried about all the things that could go wrong. Rebecca had tried to reassure him, but she understood his fear, especially given what he had shared about his mother's death. Labor began on a cool September evening, 3 days after Rebecca's 24th birthday. The pains started slowly, giving her time to send word to Laughing Waters via a young Crow man who had been visiting to trade. Dalton was beside himself with worry, exactly as predicted, hovering until Rebecca finally ordered him outside. Go chop wood or hunt something, she said firmly. Laughing Waters and I have this under control. But what if you need me? Dalton protested, looking torn between obeying her wishes and staying close. Then I will call for you, Rebecca promised. But right now, I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing and let the women work. Reluctantly, Dalton retreated outside, though Rebecca could hear him pacing on the porch throughout the long night. The labor was difficult, as first labors often were, but Rebecca drew on everything she knew and Laughing Waters' calm guidance to work through it. As dawn broke over the mountains, with golden light streaming through the cabin windows, Rebecca gave birth to a healthy baby boy. You have a son, Laughing Waters said, placing the squalling infant on Rebecca's chest. Strong lungs and perfect. Rebecca looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and absolutely beautiful, and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. Hello, little one, she whispered. Welcome to the world. Should we let your husband in before he breaks down the door? Laughing Waters asked with amusement. I can hear him out there. Yes, Rebecca laughed tiredly. Send him in. The door burst open, and Dalton rushed inside, his face pale with worry that transformed to wonder when he saw Rebecca holding their baby. He approached slowly, almost reverently, sinking down beside the bed to look at his son. "He is perfect," Dalton breathed. "Rebecca, you are amazing. Is he healthy? Are you well?" "We are both fine," Rebecca assured him. "Would you like to hold your son?" Dalton's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the baby, cradling the tiny body against his broad chest with surprising gentleness. Tears tracked down his weathered cheeks as he looked at the child, and Rebecca felt her own eyes well up at the sight of her strong mountain man brought to tears by their baby. "What should we name him?" Dalton asked, unable to take his eyes off the infant. "What about Daniel?" Rebecca suggested. "Daniel Davies. It has a good sound." "Daniel," Dalton repeated, testing the name. "Daniel Thomas Davies, after your grandmother's family name. Yes, I like that." He looked up at Rebecca with such love in his eyes that it took her breath away. "Thank you for this gift. For our son. For our life together. For everything." "Thank you for finding me," Rebecca replied. "For saving me and bringing me to where my healing hands were blessed with acceptance and purpose. For loving me." Laughing, Waters slipped quietly out of the cabin, leaving the new family to bond in private. Dalton climbed carefully onto the bed beside Rebecca, still holding Daniel, and the three of them lay together as the morning sun filled their home with light. The years that followed were rich with both challenges and joys. Daniel grew into a strong, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's quick mind. Dalton taught him to track and hunt and survive in the wilderness, while Rebecca taught him about plants and healing and the importance of helping others. When Daniel was 3 years old, Rebecca gave birth to a daughter they named Ruby Jane. She had Dalton's dark hair and Rebecca's green eyes, and she was as fierce and independent as her mother. 2 years after Ruby came another son, David, who was gentle-natured and loved animals with a passion that made him follow his father around like a shadow. Their cabin grew larger over the years as Dalton added rooms to accommodate their expanding family. The valley became a true homestead with a proper barn, a large garden, and even a few milk cows and chickens. Rebecca's reputation as a healer continued to grow, and their home became a place where people from all over the territory came for help. Dalton proved to be a wonderful father, patient and loving with their children, while teaching them the skills they needed to thrive in the wilderness. He never went back to the solitary existence he had lived before meeting Rebecca, instead throwing himself fully into family life, while still providing for them through hunting and trapping. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton surprised Rebecca by taking her back to the bluff where he had first proposed. It was a warm summer evening, and they had left the children with Laughing Waters, who, despite being in her 50s, now still had endless energy for grandmothering. 10 years, Dalton said, pulling Rebecca close as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I walked into Bozeman and saw you standing there while your world burned. Other times, I cannot remember what my life was like before you." "We have built something beautiful," Rebecca said, leaning into his warmth. "Not just our children, though they are wonderful, but this life, this community we have created. People know they can come to us for help without judgment. That matters." "You matter," Dalton said fiercely. "You took the worst day of your life and turned it into something that helps others. Your healing hands truly are blessed, Rebecca." "Because I landed somewhere I was appreciated," Rebecca replied. "Because you took me away from people who feared what they did not understand and brought me to people who valued knowledge. Because you loved me enough to change your entire life. Loving you was easy. You was," Dalton said, It was the easiest thing I have ever done." They kissed as the sun dipped below the mountains. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a life filled with love and purpose. As the years continued to pass, their family became a fixture in the Montana Territory. Daniel grew into a fine young man who worked as a guide for settlers coming west, using the wilderness skills his father had taught him. Ruby surprised everyone by showing a talent for healing that rivaled her mother's, and she often accompanied Rebecca on calls to assist with difficult births or injuries. Young David eventually partnered with his father in an expanded trapping operation, though they focused more on sustainable practices and less on the aggressive harvesting that was destroying animal populations in other areas. Dalton and Rebecca grew older gracefully, their hair turning silver while their love only deepened. They had survived harsh winters, dangerous encounters with wildlife, and the various illnesses and injuries that came with frontier life. Through it all, they remained each other's greatest support and deepest love. When Rebecca was 43, a group of settlers from Bozeman made the journey to their homestead. Rebecca answered the door to find Martha Hendricks standing on her porch. Much older now, but still recognizable. Behind her stood two other women Rebecca vaguely remembered from her time in town. "Rebecca," Martha said, her voice shaking. "I know I have no right to come here, no right to ask anything of you after what happened. But my daughter is in difficult labor, and the doctor in Bozeman does not know what to do. Someone told us you were living up here, that you had become known as the best midwife in the territory. I am begging you, please help her." Rebecca could have turned them away. Part of her wanted to. Remembering the flames consuming her herbs, the rope biting into her wrists, the hatred in the crowd's eyes. But she looked at Martha's desperate face, at the other women standing behind her with hope and shame mingled in their expressions, and she remembered why she had become a healer in the first place. "Where is she?" Rebecca asked. "In our wagon, just down the road," Martha said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Oh, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you." Rebecca called for Ruby, and together they followed the women to where a young woman in her early 20s lay in the back of a covered wagon, clearly in distress. Rebecca examined her quickly and determined that the baby was breech, which explained the difficult labor and the doctor's inability to help. "I can help," Rebecca said calmly, "but we need to get her into my cabin where I have proper supplies and room to work." Dalton appeared, having heard the commotion, and he tensed when he recognized Martha. His hand went instinctively to Rebecca's shoulder, protective as always. "Is this who I think it is?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Rebecca replied. "But her daughter needs help, and that is what matters now." Dalton studied his wife's face for a long moment, then nodded. "I will carry the girl inside." He lifted the laboring woman as easily as if she weighed nothing and brought her into their home. For the next several hours, Rebecca and Ruby worked to turn the baby and guide it safely into the world. It was delicate, dangerous work, but Rebecca's years of experience and steady hands made the difference. Finally, as evening shadows lengthened across the valley, a baby girl's cry filled the cabin. "You have a granddaughter," Rebecca said to Martha, who had been waiting anxiously outside with the other women. "Both mother and baby are healthy." Martha collapsed in relief, sobbing. "Thank you. Thank you so much. Rebecca, I have regretted what we did to you every day since it happened. Watching my own baby die, the grief made me mad, made me cruel. I know I can never make up for it. But please know I am so very sorry." Rebecca looked at the woman who had once led the charge against her, and she found that most of the anger she had carried had faded over the years. "I forgive you, Martha," she said. Holding on to hate would only poison my life, and I have too much good in it now to let that happen. You have become an amazing woman, Martha said. Everyone in the territory speaks of your skill and kindness. The town council has asked me to tell you, if I found you, that you would be welcome to return to Bozeman. They want to formally apologize for what happened. That is kind of them, Rebecca said. But my home is here now. My life is here. But if people in Bozeman need healing help, they are welcome to make the journey. I will turn no one away. After Martha and her family left the next day, with profuse thanks and a generous payment that Rebecca initially refused, but Dalton insisted she accept, Rebecca stood on the porch of their home, watching the wagon disappear down the valley. Dalton came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. "You are a better person than I am," he said. "I wanted to send them away." "Part of me wanted to as well," Rebecca admitted. "But healing is not just about the body, Dalton. Sometimes it is about healing old wounds and letting go of pain. Martha needed that closure, and honestly, so did I." "You continue to amaze me," Dalton murmured against her hair. "After all these years, you still surprise me with your capacity for forgiveness and grace." "I learned from the best," Rebecca said, turning in his arms to face him. "You showed me grace when you stepped between me and that mob. You taught me that sometimes people can change, can choose to be better. Martha did not have to come here and apologize, but she did. That took courage. Still not as much courage as you show every day," Dalton said, kissing her forehead. "But I am proud of you for helping her, even though it must have been difficult." That night, lying in bed with Dalton's arms around her, Rebecca reflected on the strange journey her life had taken. If someone had told her, 20 years ago when she first arrived in Bozeman, that she would end up living in the mountains with a husband she adored and 3 wonderful children, she would never have believed them. And if they had told her that the worst day of her life would be the catalyst for finding true happiness, she would have called them mad. But life had a way of working out in unexpected ways. The burning of her herbs had led her to Dalton, which had led her to the Crow people, which had led her to a place where her healing skills were valued and honored. She had built a life that mattered, that made a difference, and she had found love beyond her wildest dreams. The following years continued to bring new challenges and joys. When Rebecca was 50, she helped deliver her first grandchild, Daniel's son, and she cried with happiness, holding the baby boy who looked so much like Dalton had when he was young. Ruby eventually married a kind young man who had come west seeking adventure, and they built a cabin not far from Rebecca and Dalton's, carrying on the healing tradition. David remained a bachelor for longer, more interested in the wilderness than romance, though eventually he met a widow with 2 children and married her, becoming a devoted stepfather. Dalton's hair turned fully white, but he remained strong and capable well into his 60s. He still checked his trap lines, though not as extensively as before, and he spent more time working with wood, crafting furniture and toys for the growing brood of grandchildren that filled their valley with laughter. On a crisp autumn evening when Rebecca was 55 and Dalton was 65, they sat together on the porch they had built together so many years ago. Their children and grandchildren were inside preparing dinner, filling the expanded cabin with warmth and noise and love. "Do you ever regret it?" Rebecca asked suddenly. "Giving up your solitary life in the mountains for all of this chaos?" Dalton looked at her in surprise. "Never. Not for a single moment. Rebecca, before I found you, I was just surviving. I was passing time until I died. You gave me a reason to live, a reason to build something that would last. You gave me a family, a purpose, a home. How could I possibly regret that? I am glad, Rebecca said, taking his hand, their fingers intertwined, still fitting together perfectly after all these years. Because you gave me all those things too. You saved my life that day in Bozeman, Dalton. Not just from the mob, but from a future of bitterness and fear. You took me to where my healing hands were blessed, and you loved me when I needed it most. We saved each other, Dalton said, lifting her hand to his lips. And we built something beautiful together. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved, knowing that their story had come full circle. From the flames that had tried to destroy Rebecca's life had risen something stronger and more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. They had built a legacy of healing and love that would continue through their children and grandchildren for generations to come. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rebecca leaned her head on Dalton's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart and the warmth of his presence beside her. This was home. This was where she belonged. And it had all started with a mountain man who had seen an injustice and decided to intervene, who had seen a woman in need and offered her safety, who had seen her heart and decided to keep it safe forever. Their love story had not been conventional, but it had been real and deep and enduring. From that terrible day in the town square to this peaceful evening surrounded by family, they had walked through life together, facing every challenge as partners and celebrating every joy as one. The cabin door opened behind them, and Ruby called out that dinner was ready. Dalton stood and helped Rebecca to her feet, and hand in hand they walked inside to join their family. The large table Dalton had built years ago was laden with food, and children of various ages clamored for attention while the adults tried to maintain some semblance of order. Rebecca looked around the room at the faces of the people she loved most, at the life she and Dalton had created from the ashes of her old one. And she felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Her healing hands had indeed been blessed, not just with the knowledge to help others, but with the ability to build a family and a home filled with love. Years continued to pass, and both Rebecca and Dalton eventually slowed down considerably, allowing their children to take over most of the work around the homestead. But they remained sharp and engaged, offering wisdom and guidance to their growing family. Rebecca still occasionally helped with difficult cases when her expertise was needed, though Ruby had fully taken over as the primary healer for the region. On a warm summer day when Rebecca was 63 and Dalton 73, they decided to take a journey back to the Crow camp where they had first been married. It had been years since they had made the trip, and they wanted to see Laughing Waters, who was now quite elderly, but still sharp as ever. The camp had changed over the years, grown larger in some ways and smaller in others, as the pressures of westward expansion forced many native peoples onto reservations. But Laughing Waters still lived there, respected and honored by her people, and she greeted Rebecca and Dalton with joy when they arrived. "My children," she said, embracing them both. "It has been too long. Come, sit with me and tell me of your family." They spent 3 days in the camp, sharing stories and memories, laughing about old times, and marveling at how much life had changed. On their last evening there, Laughing Waters walked with them to the river, moving slowly but steadily despite her advanced age. "I am proud of what you two have built," she said, settling onto a log beside the water. "When you came to us, Rebecca, you were broken and afraid. And you, Dalton, you were closed off and alone. But together, you became something greater than either of you could have been separately. We had good teachers, Rebecca said, taking the old woman's hand. You showed me that healing is honored and respected when it is understood. You gave me a place to belong when I had nowhere else to go. You had the strength already within you, Laughing Waters said. I simply provided the space for it to flourish. And now you have passed that strength to your daughter, and she will pass it to her children. That is the way it should be. They sat together as the sun set, three people whose lives had become intertwined in the most meaningful ways, and Rebecca felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Her journey from that terrible day in Bozeman to this moment had been long and sometimes difficult, but every step had been worth it. When they returned home, they found that their eldest grandson had brought his new bride to meet them. The young woman was shy but kind, and Rebecca saw in her eyes a familiar hunger for knowledge and purpose. Over the following weeks, Rebecca began teaching her about herbs and healing, passing on yet another generation the knowledge that had been given to her. Dalton spent his days working with wood in the workshop he had built, creating beautiful furniture and small carved animals for the children. His hands were not as steady as they once were, but his skill and artistry remained, and every piece he created was imbued with the love and care he felt for his family. One evening in late autumn, when Rebecca was 68 and Dalton 78, they lay in bed talking about the future. I want you to know, Dalton said, his voice serious, that you have made my life worth living. Everything good I have experienced, every moment of joy, has come from loving you. Dalton, why are you talking like this? Rebecca asked, propping herself up on one elbow to look at him. I am an old man, Rebecca, he said simply. I have lived a good life, longer than I had any right to expect. But I need you to know, before whatever comes next, that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. Tears filled Rebecca's eyes. You are not allowed to leave me yet, she said fiercely. We still have years ahead of us. Grandchildren to watch grow up, great-grandchildren to meet. I hope so, Dalton said, reaching up to cup her face. I hope we have many more years. But if we do not, I need you to promise me something. Anything, Rebecca whispered. Keep healing people, he said. Keep using those blessed hands of yours to make the world better. And do not mourn me too long. I will have lived a full and happy life, and I will die knowing I was loved completely. That is more than most men ever get. I love you so much, Rebecca said, laying her head on his chest to hear the steady beat of his heart. More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. And I love you, Dalton replied, his arms coming around her. My brave, brilliant, beautiful Rebecca. You saved me just as much as I saved you. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Rebecca prayed that they would have many more nights like this ahead of them. Fortune smiled on them, and they did have several more good years. Dalton remained active well into his 80s, though he moved slower and tired more easily. Rebecca's hands developed arthritis that made some of her detailed work more difficult. But she adapted and continued helping people when she could. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. The valley they had claimed so many years ago was now home to a thriving family compound, with multiple cabins housing various branches of their family tree. It was exactly what both of them had dreamed of during those early days when they had first fallen in love. Dalton passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 84, with Rebecca beside him holding his hand. She mourned him deeply, but she also celebrated the incredible life they had built together. At his funeral, people came from all over the territory to pay their respects to the mountain man who had become a legend in his own right, known for his integrity, his skill, and his fierce devotion to his family. Rebecca lived for another 6 years after Dalton's death, continuing to share her knowledge and help her community. She took comfort in being surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and she spoke often of Dalton, keeping his memory alive through stories and shared wisdom. She passed away at the age of 74 on a warm spring morning. Sitting in her chair on the porch overlooking the valley she and Dalton had made their own, she simply closed her eyes and slipped away. And her family liked to think that Dalton had been waiting for her, ready to continue their journey together in whatever came next. At her funeral, Ruby spoke about her mother's courage and compassion, about how Rebecca had turned the worst day of her life into the foundation for something beautiful. She talked about the hundreds of babies Rebecca had helped bring into the world, the countless people she had healed, and the legacy of love and service she had left behind. "My mother's healing hands were truly blessed," Ruby said, her voice strong despite her tears. Not because of any magic or special power, but because she chose to use her knowledge to help others despite having every reason to turn bitter and closed off. She chose love over hate, forgiveness over vengeance, and service over self-protection. And my father recognized that in her from the very beginning. He saw her strength when others saw only someone to fear. Together, they built something that will endure long after we are all gone. The valley that had been Rebecca and Dalton's home remained in the family for generations, becoming known throughout Montana as a place where people could always find help and healing. The story of the mountain man, who saved the midwife, and the love they built together, became a cherished family legend, told and retold to new generations as an example of what courage, compassion, and true love could achieve. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the mountains in brilliant shades of gold and purple, people swore they could feel the presence of Rebecca and Dalton still watching over the valley, still protecting and blessing the family they had created from the ashes of injustice and the flames that had tried to destroy a healer's life. Their story had come full circle, from tragedy to triumph, from fear to love, from destruction to creation. The mountain man had indeed taken her to where her healing hands were blessed. And together they had built a legacy that would endure for generations to come. A testament to the power of love, courage, and the choice to see the humanity in others, even when the world chooses fear and suspicion instead. The end of their mortal lives was not the end of their story. For stories like theirs never truly end. They live on in the children who inherit their values, in the people who benefit from the traditions they established, and in the simple truth that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can become the catalyst for our greatest joys if we are brave enough to accept help, wise enough to forgive, and fortunate enough to find someone who sees our worth when the world has forgotten it. Rebecca's herbs had burned in a town square in Bozeman, Montana in 1877. But from those ashes had risen a love story for the ages, a healing legacy that spanned generations, and a family built on foundations of courage, compassion, and unwavering devotion. Dalton had taken her from that burning, and together they had created something that no fire could ever destroy.